So my name is Erika Yoney, and I'm the State School Health Consultant for the Minnesota Department of Health. So implicit bias, when I think about implicit bias, I think about the ways that our brain is always really processing so many things all at once. And so in order to make sense of the world around us, our brains really need to organize and put things into categories. But when we do that, unfortunately, we do that in the context of what we know and how our experience is, what our culture is, the various media we're exposed to. As a result of that, our brain makes these really quick connections that sometimes lead us down a path that aren't necessarily true for people, and we make snap judgments about people and experiences. Yeah, so I think our students of color are really affected by implicit bias in Minnesota. The research really tells us that we have in particular, we're looking at discipline disparities, and that when it comes to subjective interactions, something is happening that's making those snap judgments about kids of color in those moments of sort of confrontation or disagreement in the classroom. In our work with students, I think we all come to this work in education in the hopes that we can build relationship and set kids up for success in their lives, as well as, of course, impart knowledge. And when implicit bias is present in our relationships, it's a barrier between us and supporting a student's success. And I believe wholeheartedly that our educational professionals really want to figure out how to connect with students and help them succeed. I think that the first step that we all need to take is to be honest about the ways that our brains are wired, and to understand that it's not always intentional or a judgment that we're making, that it's actually the way that our brain is responding. And so if we can take that step back and just really be mindful of our own experiences and our own perceptions that we're bringing to the situation and create that space in our relationships, I think it really changes how we then react to students. So what we've learned is that a really effective way to sort of understand and handle how implicit bias shows up in schools is to adopt culturally So to address implicit bias, schools can adopt cultural humility practices in the ways that they interact with students and with each other to really foster that school climate that is supportive of everyone involved. I think you can have implicit bias without acting out a microaggression, but I think we often see implicit bias sort of intertwined with microaggressions because, generally speaking, microaggressions aren't committed as a way to propagate harm on another person. They are as a result of not knowing or not being aware. And so if you take the time to really understand your own biases that exist and really take that moment to understand yourself, hopefully you can also reduce some of those microaggressions. But I think the power that this project has is that we have really consistent data in Minnesota that both the health and education of our kids of color and our American Indian students are significantly impacted, and their outcomes are very different than our white kids. And we need to figure out how to support all Minnesota students, and this is a really great way to do it, and it's a way that we can all take some ownership. I think in Minnesota we're really fortunate that our state approach is to really look at both social determinants of health and at health equity, that health itself isn't created solely in a physician's office. And how do we account for all the experiences that people have that add up to their ability to maintain their health? Education is one of the primary things that we know leads to a life of health. So students graduating matters all the way through, not only in their educational and their career attainment, but also in just protecting their physical and mental health. So how do we support the efforts that are happening in schools that keep kids coming back and keep kids engaged in ways that will help them to have healthy futures? In Minnesota, we're really invested in both health and education, and unfortunately, we have very significant disparities especially in graduation outcomes between our white students and our students of color and our American Indian students. And we see those same groups affected by disparate health outcomes across the board, whether it's asthma, diabetes, high blood pressure, or heart conditions, those sorts of things. We see them translate back and forth, and so we need to find a way to intervene on both. Yeah, so I mean, when students don't graduate, we know that their chances of a healthy life are significantly diminished. That each educational barrier that students face also adds to a diminished likelihood that they're going to have positive health outcomes. I mean, I think another way to think about it in terms of this project is that we can see that following trauma, education gets harder and health gets harder for people to achieve. And so the more we can do to reduce those experiences of trauma in our schools and provide environments that build up resilience for our students, we also are protecting their lifelong health and their possibility of greater educational outcomes. Being aware of how trauma changes kids and their brains also helps us to feel empowered to support them and help them achieve lifelong health and education outcomes. That's not right.
Yeah, we almost have. Right.
So,
kind of string along.
Yeah, so maybe what's exciting about working in schools is that we have a really powerful role that we can play in being aware of the trauma that students face, addressing it where we can, and support, and that will have this outcome of being able to support their lifelong health and education.
Cool.
Maybe outcome isn't the right word, but well, I think the first step is to have honest conversation about it, that we need this opportunity to sit down and talk with staff about it, and then we all need to take the time to sort of personally reflect and think about interactions rather than sort of reacting, right? We need to create that space to be intentional about our interactions with students versus trying to immediately respond to the behavior or conversation in front of us. So the first step in awareness about implicit bias is our self-awareness. How do we understand what it is, how it shows up for us, and what ways it impacts our relationships with students? And once we're sort of aware of that, then we can learn some tools to be mindful and really make sure that our interactions align with our values.
Awesome.
So our brains are doing a lot of work to take in information all day, every day, and as a result, we need to quickly organize information, and our brains are really skilled at this, and unfortunately, it doesn't always make the best decisions, and they happen quickly before we even realize it's happening. And so with implicit bias, our brain is making a decision for us about a situation or a person or a concept before we've necessarily fully processed and taken the time to think, does this match with what I think? Implicit bias shows up often before we even realize what we've done or said, and it doesn't necessarily reflect how we truly feel. So implicit bias often shows up in schools in our relationships with students that are confrontational or when a student is displaying a behavior that we're concerned about, it often shows up in subjective discipline at schools. And in Minnesota, we're really dealing right now with how do we address our significant differences between discipline actions for our students of color and our American Indian students versus our white students.